Hi, I am Deborah R. Richardson, and I am always putting the AP in happy. I help you clean your vendor data, clean your vendor processes so that you can pay the right vendor. And this week's Vendor Master File tip of the week is authentication. And authentication is the same as when you contact your bank, for example, and they ask you 2 to 3 questions about yourself so that they can make sure they're talking to you and not a fraudster. You need to do the same thing with your vendors. So when your vendors communicate with you either through email or phone, you need to identify that they are who they say they are. And that is before you start talking about their inquiry. And I'll tell you why. I had a accounts payable manager reach out to me, and yes, they had the phone call when they had a vendor existing bank change, and that's fine. But the problem is that they were taking phone calls and emails for payment status on invoices from fraudsters. They didn't know they were fraudsters, but they were fraudsters trying to figure out when the next payment was going to come through. And once they found out when the next payment was coming, they would then know when to submit a change for vendor banking and then hope that that will go through. Well, fortunately, that AP manager did not have a fraudulent payment because they were contacting the vendor prior to making that change. But here's the problem. Now you've got your internal team members that are taking that call. Now they're getting in that information for these fraudulent changes, and they're having to reach out to the vendor. Well, that's not one, it's a lot of manual work. And how good, number two, does that look with your vendor that you're letting it get that far? So don't let it get that far. Authenticate your vendors prior to discussing with them the reason for the inquiry. And the way that you do that is just like your bank. Ask them 2 to 3 things that only you and the vendor would know. For example, you want to ask them things from different sets of information. So you want to ask them things from, let's say, the invoicing information, or from purchasing information, or from the vendor data that is in your vendor file. And you want to ask them at least 1 or 2 from each category, because you don't want a fraudster getting a hold of an invoice and being able to authenticate themselves. So an example would be, you would ask the vendor or fraudster a invoice number, and then you would pair that by also asking them for their last 4 digits of the bank account number from the vendor information, your vendor master file, or the buyer's name from the purchasing order information. Or you can ask them for a purchase order number along with the last 4 or 5 digits of the tax ID. And so you want to have, again, questions from different sets of data. And then you also want to make sure you have some choices so that as these fraudsters are continuing to call back, they're not being asked the same thing. So have 3 to 4 choices from each category of information so that your AP help desk team will have choices to make that kind of more random. So you do want to make sure that they have enough random questions that they can ask. So that is this week's Vendor Master File Tip of the Week, authentication. And if you'd like some help in customizing and building your own, I will have a link in the description that where you can sign up and enroll for authentication workshops. And see you next week for the new week's Vendor Master File Tip of the Week.